Hi everybody. So today I wanted to do a bit of a thought experiment or imagination. So let's imagine for the moment that we step back in time 2 years and we imagine that we're US President Joe Biden. He was still president 2 years ago, and we're precisely going to imagine the day when he decided that they were going to put in sanctions against Russia. Knowing all that we know now in the past 2 years, and knowing what we know now about the motivations for why we got to that point, was that a good idea? So I'm not going to debate with anybody who believes the various propaganda that's been spewed by pro-American, anti-Russian propagandists and absolute liars. I'm going to just focus on what we know to actually be the case, which is that Russia invaded Ukraine, and they definitely invaded Ukraine, no question about that. In fact, Russians aren't denying that. They invaded Ukraine in response to a request for help from the people of the Donbass, or Donetsk and Lugansk, however you say that, they were declared by Ukraine to be autonomous region, but they self-declared themselves to be independent nations. Either way, whether you're autonomous or an independent nation, you can still ask another nation for help. There are other autonomous regions around the world. It's not the only one in the world. There's quite a lot of them. Because officially Crimea is an autonomous region of Ukraine as well. Neither region are under Ukrainian control. Neither region want to be under Ukrainian control. It's just that Ukraine have said, no, you're not allowed to leave the country, you can be autonomous, that's all. A bit like how the Spanish/French region of the Basque, they want to be independent nations but not allowed to be, so they have to be autonomous instead. There's a lot of autonomous regions around the world. They're countries that essentially want to be independent but aren't allowed to, perhaps because they don't have enough money or there's some legal requirement that they stay with whichever country has control of them at the moment. And with all of these anti-invasion laws that we have right now, autonomous regions are becoming more common. In fact, we're getting more and more nations, because nations are allowed to become new nations, they're allowed to split off, but they're not allowed to merge with anyone. Just not allowed. Obviously, eventually, we'll end up with far too many countries, and so we'll have to allow merging, but at the moment it's not allowed. Banned worldwide. We might get back to the situation we had in the Middle Ages, where we had tens of thousands of city-states around the world. Every city was its own country. So that's what we're heading towards. But I digress a bit. So they asked Russia for help. Now some people will say, oh, but they were actually pressured by Russia. Well, we can prove they weren't. There were votes and so forth. So they asked Russia for help. In fact, Russia hadn't even recognised them as independent nations until a month earlier. So the idea that they were secretly Russian things, it really doesn't have any substance. There's a lot of evidence that they didn't want to be a part of Ukraine. Didn't want to be a part of Russia either. But yeah, they asked for help. And the reason they asked for help was because Ukraine were attacking them. And there are some estimates that Ukraine had killed 15,000 people in the Donbass between 2014 and 2022. There are some claim that they were all civilians, some claim they weren't civilians. So there's different claims, doesn't really matter for the purposes of this argument. All we know is that Ukraine were attacking them, they didn't want to be attacked, they wanted to be independent or at least autonomous, so they asked Russia for help. And that's the actual reason that Russia invaded. Now, why didn't Russia limit themselves to the Donbass? Well, mainly because they thought that they could stop it once and for all by attacking Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine. They failed in that, but in 2014 they had succeeded with that during a similar effort when Crimea asked for help, when they wanted to leave Ukraine. Though in Crimea's case they wanted to actually join Russia. So either way, asked for help, Russia went in, did what from their point of view at least was the noble thing. So we know that happened. And we also know why Ukraine were attacking the Donbass. wasn't because Ukraine wanted the Donbass back. Of course they didn't. They don't care. They don't want a place back that doesn't want to be back, because that's going to be very problematic. As if Ukraine want the Donbass back, they'd have to kill everybody in the Donbass and replace them with someone else. And that's going to be just generations of problems. There'll be hundreds of years of infighting, of rebellions. You're never going to control that area properly. So you don't want that. And it's just not something that you want. If you want an area for yourself, it's because you have some sort of claim to that area. You know, you have people in that area that want to be part of your country. If it's not the majority, at least you'd want something close to 50%, so you can kill a few and then say, oh well, the majority of those that are left want to be on our side. But that's not the case in the Donbass, nor is it the case in Crimea, where 90% or more don't want to be in Ukraine. And that's, you know, you're not going to do it for 8% or something like that. It's just not going to work. So Ukraine don't want the Donbass. They say they want it, but the reason that they say that is because of pressure from USA. So why does USA want Ukraine to take the Donbass? Well, they don't either, but it's really just to annoy Russia and to provoke a war. So USA told Ukraine to attack the Donbass, which they hadn't done, didn't want to do, that they were told to attack them so that Russia would get upset and invade, so that then they could, well, it wasn't actually even about destroying Russia. It was about making Russia look bad in the eyes of China. So they couldn't destroy Russia because Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. It's pretty obvious they couldn't destroy Russia, because if they could, they would have actually sent people in to invade. They would have sent American troops, and they would have gone a lot further than just the Donbass. They would have gone into Russia. That hasn't happened, and we know why. So it's ultimately a proxy war that's very indirect, and it's all about trying to make China distant from Russia. And the reason for that is because if China and Russia ally up properly, then in any one of a number of different ways, China will become very rich and very powerful very quickly, or China/Russia will. And of course, several ways that could happen. One is that they just become best friends, probably fairly unlikely. Another way is that China will invade Russia and defeat them, because Russia's not going to win that war. And another one is that China and Russia have a bit of a fight, and then Russia agrees to cede some territory to China and let them annex a part of the country. So it's a few different ways that it could work out. But USA don't want any of them, except for the all-out war where they both wipe each other out scenario. So essentially, the aim of this, from USA's point of view, why they wanted Ukraine to attack the Donbass, was so that China would back off from Russia and would stop trying to be friends, stop trying to take them over and just sort of want nothing to do with them. That was the aim. And the aim for that is because China/Russia would be far stronger than USA and would wipe them out, just kick them out. It wouldn't be a joint Cold War situation, it would be a dominant display where China/Russia could be anything up to 3 to 5 times stronger than USA. And yeah, USA would not be invaded, but they would lose all power and influence over the world. So that's what this is about. This is not a World War III situation, but it's more about USA trying to hold on to their grip on power over the whole world. So they still have. That's what it's about. So then we want to look at what was the situation, how did the start of this war go? Well, first thing, instead of Russia just going into the Donbass, had Russia just gone into the Donbass, it would have been supported by most of the world. But they went for the whole country, and that was not supported. That was an overreach, and USA were able to pump propaganda into overdrive over that, and everybody in the world hated Russia. Did a great job there. It's a very successful propaganda campaign. CIA celebrated, because it was mainly led by the CIA. All going really well. People were putting in donations all over the place to support Ukraine, give them all lots of weapons. Ukraine didn't fall over. All that money and infrastructure that USA had been pumping in there for the previous 8 years worked, at least to slow them down. Sure, they lost a lot of territory, but they didn't lose the whole thing. Kiev didn't fall, almost fell, but didn't quite. And things couldn't be going better. So then we get the situation of sanctions. Was that a good idea? So I'm not going to question the rest of it, because if you assume that USA wanted to stay in power and had that as their aim, the rest of it they could justify. Not saying it was morally good or morally bad, because it depends on your perspective. If your perspective is you don't want China to rule the world, and you think that China would destroy the world, absolutely this is a good thing. Of course, if your perspective is that USA is ruining the world and you want China to have a go, then it was a bad thing. But they're both subjective opinions. So we can't really say objectively whether it was good or bad for them to do this. Now you might say, okay, they're bombing the Nord Stream pipeline to force Germany into the war and to force NATO to support them. Was pretty cruel, and particularly when they blamed Russia for it. But, you know, so be it. These sort of things often happen in war. It doesn't really change the moral compass that much. And the thing is, though, that when you get to it, what was the benefit of sanctions? Well, here in Australia we know that sanctions have caused the cost of living crisis, where people are not able to pay for their food. And this is because the price of petrol went up so much, because we were so reliant on Russian oil, and then had to rely on American oil, which is much more expensive and harder to get for us, that we just can't afford to eat. There's people, well, I mean, I suppose they're not absolutely starving to death because we've each helped each other out, but it's hurt us a lot economically, financially, and in terms of raw food. We have a food shortage. Other countries, including Germany, have energy shortages. Their power is far too expensive. And this is all because of this, these sanctions. Has it hurt Russia? I've heard reports say it hurt them slightly, and other reports say that it hasn't made any difference, and some even that it's helped them. And what difference has it made? Well, the main difference as far as the whole Russia-China alliance, remember that's the main point of this war, is that Russia has become more reliant on trade with China. In fact, it sort of had the opposite effect of the intended. So the intention was to drive them apart. It's actually driven them further together. Russia are being forced now to buy Chinese cars. China are now buying Russian oil because Russia can't sell it to anyone else. Except for India, who sort of went along with it. And of course, Pakistan, they decided to become neutral, and USA reacted by getting rid of their Prime Minister Imran Khan, which has had another flow-on effect, because people are going, hang on, USA, what are you doing interfering in your allies' leadership? What the heck? And of course then in USA we have the whole thing going on with Donald Trump, which also makes them look pretty bad. They're interfering with their own leadership. And USA is looking very corrupt. Not to mention, of course, the Ukraine have stopped elections, plus of course they've arrested their own political leaders and all that sort of nonsense. They're looking pretty corrupt too. But out of the three countries, Russia looks the least corrupt. Not that they don't look at least a little bit corrupt, but they don't look as corrupt as USA or Ukraine. Certainly not with what we're aware of, at least. And, you know, but the sanctions, let's wind this back and say there's no sanctions. What's the difference? Well, here in Australia, we'd be not that much, well, we might still care about the war, but it's way over there. It's between countries we don't care about. And we'd be still having the same cost of living as normal. Countries like Germany wouldn't be forced to take sides. They'd be able to make up their own minds. You know? And when you pressure countries to take your side or else, you're not really an ally, are you? USA is not acting like an ally to Australia or to Germany or to Pakistan. And that really hurts. All while doing this, the aim is to push China and Russia apart, but in reality it's pushing them together, and all it's doing is pushing for more of an unequal alliance than we had before. So instead of China and Russia looking at each other pretty much evenly and not sure how to negotiate an alliance, it's now China's much more powerful compared to Russia and has much more leverage, which means that China can now fairly safely push for a partial annexation of Russia. And even a partial annexation, giving enough room for perhaps 100 million Chinese to flood into parts of Russia, would benefit both countries enormously. It also benefit Russia too. Russia could give up some of their land to China and it'd increase their infrastructure, there would be deals that could be made, and even if it was 10% of their land that they ceded in response and sold it for a certain amount of money or a certain regular amount of money, it'd be quite a big deal, and something like that is now on the cards. Sure, Americans are trying to say, oh, China's going to attack Taiwan and be held off. Well, no. If you look at how China's viewing Taiwan, they don't really care about it. It's more sort of, oh, well, they just consider it to be theirs, and it's such a small thing that it doesn't really matter. They're more interested in South Korea and Japan, much more than Taiwan. They'd fight over South Korea and Japan. They wouldn't fight over Taiwan. Taiwan will come once South Korea and Japan have fallen. They're not going to butt their heads against the wall of Taiwan until it's easy to take and worthwhile doing. At the moment, it's not worth it. So, Americans are lying about that, about the whole Taiwan situation. They're focusing on the wrong place. Yes, China are interested in taking Taiwan, but it's not a high priority target. If you look at the strength and value of South Korea, and South Korea shares a border with North Korea, which China effectively control. South Korea is a lot easier to take. They can take them by land, and it has a lot more benefit than Taiwan. So they take South Korea, and then from there they take Japan. Much easier targets, much more value, and then they take Taiwan afterwards. Why would they be so stupid as to go in and take Taiwan first? They're not going to be that dumb. So realistically, they're talking about the wrong region. Sure, those three regions are all pretty geographically close to each other, so you'd probably take them one after the other. And sure, well, after South Korea and Japan fall, Taiwan will go. But don't you think that China will wait until they have a bit more power and shore up their alliance or annexation with Russia first? You'd think they would. They're patient, they say. It might be 20 years before Taiwan falls. So, 30 even. And they don't care. So that's the thing, that when we're looking at this and we're looking at all these sanctions and stuff, if we had it to do again, I don't think that USA would have sanctions. It's just made them hated around the world. Sure, they're able to maintain this facade that people like them, but that's only because they've lied so heavily about Russia that everybody hates Russia so much. They've got Facebook allowing hate speech against Russia. They've got people stealing Russian gold. They've got people refusing to do business with people who have Russian ancestry. And all that sort of thing. You've got sports banning Russia, you've got them not allowing the Russian flag, you've got people not shaking hands with Russians, and all this sort of stuff. And that helps America to look a bit better than they would once all of this comes out. So once this war ends, however it ends, and we know that Russia's going to win because there's no way that Ukraine can win, but once that finishes, USA is going to look really bad. They're going to look so bad that this whole facade will crumble. And when that happens, then people will be questioning, was this trade embargo really a good idea? And they'll say, no, we were impoverished so that America could look a little bit better for a little bit longer at the expense of their allies. And that's a really bad thing. It's not only evil, or however you want to call that, because again, depends on your perspective, but it's just stupid. It's just a bad move all around. Maybe it helps USA slightly economically for a short period of time, but the long-term consequences are very, very negative for USA, well, for everybody. The only country that benefits from it, arguably, is Russia, and more than that, China. China's happy for the trade embargo. Russia are fairly happy. Everybody else is annoyed. And Joe Biden, perhaps whoever helped him to make that decision, didn't think it through. This is perhaps one of the worst decisions in military history. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye-bye now.